all very much for being with us tonight. The rector is very sorry that he couldn't be here. I'll be stepping in for him tonight. My name is Kala Saleh, and I am a research officer with the Center for Policy Research, which is a small research institute here at UNU. And we generate policy research that informs major UN policy processes in the fields of security, humanitarian affairs, and global development. So we are delighted to have with us tonight the Director General, Guy Ryder, who is going to speak to us tonight about a very interesting topic, which is the future of work. And this is the subject of the ILO's Centenary Initiative, and it's to mark the organization's 100th anniversary, which will be in 2019. You all, I think, have seen Mr. Ryder's bio, but I'll just give you a brief overview. He has served as the ILO Director General since October 2012 and was recently reelected for a second term, which will commence in October 2017. Previously, he served as the ILO's Executive Director, and he has also had a very distinguished career as General Secretary of both the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions and its successor organization, the International Trade Union Confederation. He has studied social and political sciences at the University of Cambridge and Latin American studies at the University of Liverpool. So without further ado, we'll get started. And Director General, maybe just to get us started, I can ask you to tell us more about the ILO's Centenary Initiative, and in particular, why ILO chose the future of work as the subject for this occasion.
Yeah, and let me also say thank you to you and to everybody for being here tonight. I hope we're going to give you a lively Friday evening by having a good conversation. I'll try not to be too boring. Now, why is the ILO embarking on this Future of Work initiative? Well, the first reason is we have a 100th birthday, and when you're 100 years old, you have to do something special. You will have understood that being 100 years old, the ILO is older than the United Nations. We're a survivor of the old League of Nations. We were formed after the First World War. Now, why do I talk about this history? Because the idea of the International Labour Organization was born from the experience of World War I. And the international community understood that there was a need to ensure better conditions of work, promote social justice, if we were to secure peace. That there is a really tight link between fairness and justice in our societies and the preservation of peace. Now that message is 100 years old. That was 1919 when people thought about that. And as we come up to being 100 years old, the question is, does that message still resonate? Is that really how life is 100 years later? And my view is, the answer is yes. That people, but you can tell me if I'm wrong, younger people, older people, they want social justice, they want fairness in society as a value, and the ILO as an organization which deals with the world of work, which brings together governments, employers, and workers, is well placed, I think critically placed, to promote social justice. So the belief is the world of work is the factory of social justice. If work offers opportunities, our societies will be fairer, our societies will be stable. That's a starting point. Now, today, I think most of us would agree, the world of work, I can see some of you have been in the world of work for quite a few years, others are probably just beginning to think about the world of work. I think we would all agree that the world of work is undergoing transformative change. It's changing quickly, it's changing profoundly. The way that the people entering the labour market today will work is probably going to be very different from the way your parents worked, very different from the way your grandparents worked. And there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of worry around about what working life will look like in the future. So our Centenary Initiative is an attempt, Kali, to try to understand what is changing in the world of work, what's happening, and how we can act together, when I say together, governments, employers, and workers around the world, to try to make sure that this world of work offers people a decent job opportunity, a decent life opportunity, and are the building blocks for our decent societies. So we have to understand change, and we have to understand what we should be doing to move change in the direction of social justice.
Well, let's pick up on that point about decent work. The Sustainable Development Goal number 8 calls for quite an ambitious target. It calls for full and productive employment and decent work for all, and equal pay for work of equal value by the year 2030. Now, realistically speaking, how far off are we from that target? And how do the trends associated with the future of work, how will those trends affect our trajectory towards achieving Sustainable Development Goal number 8?
Well, I can give you a very precise answer to your question, how far away are we from those targets? Today, there are about 200 million people without a job in the world, openly unemployed. If you're under 25, you are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than other adults. The mathematics is that to achieve that full employment target by 2030, the world has to create 600 million new jobs in the next 13 years. 600 million. So that's the size of that ambition. What about equal pay for work of equal value? The gender pay gap, just to take one statistic in the world today, if you average out the different national figures, the average is 23%. 23%. So for every dollar or whatever it is a man takes home, for the same work a woman takes home just 73 cents. It's a massive injustice. And the big worry there, I think, is that there is no clear trend for that gender pay gap to narrow. It's staying the same. In some cases, it's increasing. So we really have to step up our game if we're going to make these, I think, very worthy and very correct ambitions a reality. But on current trajectories, we're not going there.
I want to touch on one of the major things that's affecting the future of work and the changes in the nature of work, which is technology. I mean, there is major widespread anxiety over the prospects of job automation and what that means for human labor. I mean, one could argue that these anxieties are overblown because history has shown that technology over the long run has actually created more jobs than it has destroyed. But on the other hand, we could argue that the fourth industrial revolution, as it's called, is something different.
Sure.
That big data, machine learning, 3D printing presents unprecedented potential for replacing human labor. So how do you think that policymakers should manage the transition period toward whether we're moving towards a shrinking workspace or not? And how realistic do you think is a workless future?
You're anticipating our discussion in the Future of Work initiative because these are central questions to which I have to tell you I don't think there are definitive answers at the moment. Look, one thing is true by definition. Technological innovation both destroys jobs and creates jobs. That's always been true, from the first to the second to the third industrial revolutions. What the great economist Schumpeter called the gales of creative destruction. Jobs will be destroyed by technology, jobs will be created. The question is where that balance will lie. Now, if you look at the literature, you can get the answer that you want. There are those who think that this is going to kill work on a massive scale. There are others who believe that the fourth industrial revolution, after the necessary and usual turbulence associated with change, will leave us, as previous revolutions have, better off, more jobs, more prosperous. Now, I think there are reasons to be more worried this time, if you want my personal view. And by the way, coming to Japan has been a refreshing experience because I find the level of anxiety about technology very much lower here in Japan than, for example, I come from Britain. We're all scared, terrified of it. Why is this the case? Firstly, because, of course, you do have such a tight labor market in Japan. unemployment under 3%, my goodness. You have your demographics of aging, which means that technology looks like it's going to come in as a problem solver rather than a problem creator. But Japan stands out as an exception, in my view. But here is my answer to your question after all of this. It is a mistake to believe that the future of labour markets will be determined and the future levels of employment will be determined by technology. This is not just an abstract debate about technology. It is a policy debate. And everything, I think, depends on how we manage technology. And to say that is beyond our capacities, to say that it is futile to try to direct or control technological innovation, I think is wrong. Take the Japanese example. I remember when I was younger, 1980s, Japan was #1 in robotics. We all looked to Japan, extraordinary success in automation and robotics. And the corporate culture, and my friend Matsui-san will remind me of this, the corporate culture in Japan was, yes, you automate, yes, you bring in robots, but the corporate culture is you keep your workers. There was a sort of a implicit contract. Japan successfully managed technological innovation to the advantage of the workforce and the cohesion of society. Now, you might say that's an example from old history, but I think it has lessons for us. We can manage the introduction, we can adapt our policy settings to draw the social benefits from technology. Now, what about this big question of a workless future? There is a school of thought which says that in the future, work is going to be a scarce social commodity. It will have to be shared. It's not a new idea. Anybody who read Karl Marx in their youth, as some of us did, he saw this. Karl Marx saw a future where work would be a leisure activity, because a combination of technology and what he saw as rational social organization would enable us to live in a future of work scarcity but abundance and social harmony. It sounds like a dream. Like most things that Marx said, it didn't come true. But you see, this is not a new idea. Now, the key point for me in this regard is whether or not we can rely upon work and the remuneration of work, salaries, wages, as the primary determinant of income distribution. I think the history of capitalism has shown that your place in society, your income is determined by what you earn from work. Now, if work becomes prohibitively scarce in the future, we're going to have to think of either alternatives or supplements to income distribution. And this is where the idea of a universal guaranteed income comes in. In a number of countries, people are saying, look, we understand in the future, work is not going to be the efficient distributor of income. So we have to supplement it by socially guaranteed incomes. I'm not convinced of that argument, but it is certainly an argument that you're hearing with greater and greater frequency. One example is the recent elections in France, where one candidate made universal guaranteed income the centerpiece of his campaign. He only got 6% of the vote, so it wasn't a very good advert for the idea. But you see, these are current debates, and I think they're going to be with us more and more.
And very relatedly to the question of basic income, and also how policymakers need to manage this transition, is the question of inequality. What will be the impact of new technologies, and in particular job automation, on inequality both between nations and within nations? And how does the ILO think that policymakers need to ensure that the benefits of technology are equitably distributed so that technology doesn't exacerbate inequality?
The starting point for my answer to you is recognition that inequality as it exists today is at unacceptable levels. Now, I believe that in most of our societies, and between our societies, we've reached unacceptable levels of inequality. Now, 10 years ago, that would have been a very controversial statement. Today, the UN Sustainable Development Agenda contains a specific goal on the reduction of inequality, which I take as international recognition that we have excessive levels of inequality which needs to be reduced. And by the way, I think one of the big changes in the policy discourse of the last 3 or 4 years is that inequality is now recognized not only as being a social problem, a social ill, but also as an economic problem. It is the International Monetary Fund, no less, which has done important research which demonstrates rather persuasively that current levels of inequality are creating joblessness and inhibiting growth. So you have an alignment of social considerations and economic considerations, which I think reinforce the importance of your question. Now, one of the great fears is, of course, that technology, as it is coming on stream today, innovation, is going to exacerbate inequalities. Why? Because it will reward scarce, high-skilled professions very, to a great extent, and it will render those without skills to deal with technologies in a very much weaker situation in labour markets. Now, I don't have an easy answer to that, because I think if technology is not managed, like globalization, it is going to distribute its benefits very unequally. And yes, we have to counteract that tendency. Now, there are many ways you can do that. And the strange thing is, they're very familiar policy instruments for anybody who comes from the world of work. It's about minimum wages. It's about collective bargaining. It's about social protection. It's about tax policies and distribution. Strange thing is, these policies have gone out of fashion for the last 30 years. They have been identified as being unhelpful to economic success. In my country, from about 1980, the trend was to deregulation, low tax, get rid of minimum wages, weaken collective bargaining. And the strange thing is, inequality was growing inequality was an accepted part of the policy mix, which was recognized as being necessary for economic success, particularly in the increasingly globalized economy. I think that paradigm has to change. We talk very often about paradigm change. I don't like it. It's a bit of a cliche. But I think we're at that moment of paradigm change. Or else we will face increasing inequality, and I think that is wrong for social and economic reasons. I also think it's very dangerous politically and even for the stability of our societies.
I'd like to shift to another major trend that's affecting the future of work, which is demographic shifts. We're sitting in Japan.
Yeah.
Japan is the oldest country in the world. 25% of the Japanese population is over the age of 65. So a big question of concern here regards the future of the care economy. What do you see as the future of work portending for the care economy, and what do you think the role of technology is within that care economy when we're talking about the elderly?
Yeah. Demographics is one of the crucial issues for the future of work. And as you say, Getty, sitting in Japan, you take a particular point of view, a particular perspective, because par excellence, this is the aging society. If we were having this discussion in Africa or in South Asia, we would be talking about the youth bulge. We would be talking about the young populations, where more and more young people are coming onto the labor market and the need to create jobs for young people. So I think the future of work is about different demographics, very different demographics in different parts of the world. And by the way, before I come to your precise question, that raises a question of labor mobility internationally. If you have some regions and countries of the world where labor is in short supply, and others where it's in excess supply, the obvious answer is migration, is labour mobility. And whether countries like it, whether it is a result of conscious policy, I have no doubt that we will be seeing large-scale movement of people in the labour market in the future. That can be regulated, it can be irregular, but it will happen. And we need to open our eyes to that. And I know that has very particular connotations here in Japan. But let's talk about the care economy and all of the issues around aging. Self-evidently, when you have such a rapidly and extensively growing dependency ratio, more people who are older than a normal workforce age, a reduced level of people in the workforce, you have to adapt. And there are several ways you can adapt. One, you can try to extend the period of working life. So people work longer, beyond what we have come to accept as our normal retirement age. And you see many countries in the world which have linked very precisely and mathematically, they have indexed the retirement age to longevity, life expectancy. This is Germany, this is Norway. A Danish child born today, a kid born in Denmark, can expect to work until he or she is 70 years old. This is socially accepted. This is considered to be good policy in the face of an aging society. The other piece, of course, is the care economy. Now, what is interesting in Japan, and I was having a conversation about this yesterday, is not just that aging is becoming mathematically more present in populations, it's what was described to me as the depth of aging. More and more people who will live and continue to live for a long time, beyond 75, beyond 80, when demand for care becomes almost the normal thing. There's going to be an enormous demand for care. And there are two ways, I think, that policymakers have to respond. One is to re-engineer labour markets so that people of working age have a better capacity to reconcile their professional life with care responsibilities. And I think in Japan, you probably all know situations where people have to withdraw from the labour force or cannot participate fully in the labour force because they have to either look after elderly relatives or they have to look after the kids. So getting work-life balance correct is one part of the story. The second part of the story is to organise not just family support systems, but professional social support systems. The care economy per se as a source of employment has to be organised, has to be financed. But here's the bad news. The demand for care does not create automatically and of itself the capacity to supply that care. I come from the United Kingdom, a relatively aging society. The demand for care has gone up very, very quickly, and yet the care supply, the National Health Service, and social care is in crisis. So here's my point. When there is greater demand for care, it does not mean that societies are necessarily able to provide that care. And so public policy has to react to that. Can technology help in all of this? Very definitely. Very definitely. And since I've been in Tokyo, I've had many conversations and I've had a lot explained to me about how the different applications of technology, be it robotics or whatever else, can be extraordinarily helpful in the provision of care. But it does not replace, cannot replace, but has to supplement human intervention, particularly in the caring professions. No, the human element, I think by definition, is vital to the provision of care.
Thank you so much. Let's end this part of the conversation by picking up on one point that you made in your comments just now, which is about the exact opposite demographic challenge that other countries face, the youth bulge. So the Secretary General said in his speech at the Munich Security Conference this year that he thinks that youth unemployment may be one of the biggest security risks facing the world today. What do you make of his assessment? I mean, what are the risks associated with youth unemployment, and what does the future of work portend for the prospects of youth employment?
Look, we didn't write the Secretary General's speech, but we could have done. There is no doubt in my mind that where you have large-scale youth unemployment, you almost by definition have social instability and, at least in embryo, a security threat. I don't think, you're an expert, Kelly, so I'm going to say something stupid, you won't laugh. I don't think it is a coincidence that the highest levels of youth unemployment in the world for decades has been in North Africa and the Middle East. We know why the Arab Spring began in Tunisia, because an unemployed young man set himself on fire out of frustration. I think that large-scale unemployed youth is, as the Secretary General of the United Nations has said, a real security risk. It's one reason, but not the only reason, why we have to give priority attention to the 75 million young people under the age of 25 who are without a job today. I have to tell you, I am amazed, really amazed, that when youth unemployment in Greece, youth unemployment in Spain went above 50% 3 or 4 years ago, in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, that did not result in social instability. If anybody had asked me in advance if I thought that democratic society, a normal civil process could survive that level of youth unemployment intact, I would have said, no, that's impossible. It happened. But not only the security risks, the pure human misery of mass youth unemployment is an imperative to action. Anybody who has, I think, lived amongst, talked to, dealt with unemployed young people must realize that this is just a massive and unacceptable waste of human potential, human talent, and human life, quite honestly. So I think we absolutely, for all of these reasons, have to address youth unemployment as an absolute priority.
Thank you so much, Director General. That was very fascinating. And I'm going to turn it over to the audience now. We're going to take questions. We're going to take 2 questions at a time. And I would ask you to please keep your questions very brief. And please state your name and affiliation when you ask a question.
Yeah, my name is Dr. Kazura. I'm Coimbatore Institute of Technology in India. So my question is very simple. You know, that you recommend mobility of the labor or not, because you know, you said you know, the unemployment in you know, if the you know, moving the people for the labor, so you know, but in some area it will be have the more competitor for the taking a job. So how to manage the you know, this contradiction?
We'll take one more question. It's over here in the middle on the side. There's a hand up.
I'm Celine Miyazaki from Health Policy Department. I have 2 points. First, I have an opposite point of view of what you said about extending the age of working age. Actually, I don't think that is a very good intervention. So please give, if
Sure.
you have
Yeah.
some comment on that. But second of all, I'm really concerned about prejudice about hiring immigrants in our future where work is being scarce. For example, like nursing. In Japan, we are lacking nurses, and we would like to invite more foreign nurses to come to Japan and work. But the policy seems to be restricting the flexibility of inviting more migrants. What kind of intervention do you think can help to improve that? Thank you.
So the two questions both talked about migration in slightly different ways, so let me say something about that. I'll try and be quick because I saw all the hands going up. Look, what I said is, and I think I'm right, is that when you have these very different situations in different parts of the world, in terms of labour demand and labour supply, people will move. People will move. You can't stop it, even if you want to. The question is, how do you manage these movements? Now, everybody agrees that migration should not be illegal, should not be irregular, should not be undocumented. It needs to be legal and orderly. This is what the UN position is, and I agree. I agree. Why? Because illegal, irregular migration causes multiple problems, and it also leaves workers open to exploitation. It leaves them vulnerable. Think of the 11 million undocumented migrants in the United States today, and think of the circumstances in which they find themselves. So we need to do this in a regulated, orderly way. Now, it is true that sometimes workers in a country fear that their working conditions, their pay, will be undercut by migrants. They will be subjected to unfair competition. The answer to that problem is in the ILO's basic principle of equal treatment. Our principle is, if you do the same job, if you're a migrant or a national, you get the same pay, you get the same conditions. Non-discrimination. And that is what should happen. Unfortunately, in reality, it doesn't work out like that. We know that where labour inspection and enforcement is not effective, it doesn't work. So we have to strengthen, in my view, the institutions to manage migration. Now, the example of health professionals is very interesting in the nursing profession. I served on a commission on the future of the health workforce established by the President of France and South Africa over the last year. The biggest problem, well, there are two problems. One, of course, is we don't seem to produce enough nurses and doctors in most industrial countries. So we need to bring in people from other countries. At the same time, the problem in the developing world is the brain drain, that nursing and medical professionals are leaving. They're trained. If you go to the Philippines, if you go to Namibia, they go. So there's two sides to this story. But the questioner said, what about prejudice? What about non-acceptance of foreigners in our labour markets? Well, I have to say that is a phenomenon, that is a cultural, social reaction that each country is going to have to get used to. It's going to have to think very carefully about what it wants. In my own country, we're both British, I've seen a revolution changing attitudes towards multiculturalism and migration in my lifetime. Japan has its own dynamics, its own views. But I think there'll be more and more pressure to, given the labour market dynamics in the world, to get used to the idea that we do have to accept greater international mobility of labour.
Two more questions. We'll take one here.
Thank you. Veselin Popovsky, professor in law in Jindal University in India. My question is on a major challenge, which is child labor. As we talked earlier about youth unemployment, it's kind of paradoxical where countries both have young people unemployed in parallel with children exploitation. So is there any good news to be expected in terms of reduction of child labor?
Great. And one more. There's someone here on the end, right? Yes.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Anna Musnyaga. I work currently for WFP here in Japan. I wanted to ask you about, since you mentioned that there is also a lot of irregular work taking place, and especially about how do you view the issue of the so-called emerging precariat. So young people with, degrees and a lot of qualifications, but that cannot find jobs beyond, let's say, 3 months contract without any paid leave, without any insurance, and that is not a trend that we see decreasing. On the opposite, I think that we see it growing, and we find it in many different sectors. So I would like to hear your view on this. Thank you.
So first on child labour, is there any good news? You probably know one piece of good news if you live in India, which is that India, which is of course a major player in the child labour story, has just agreed to ratify the ILO's 2 child labour conventions. It's a great story, and it will help us to combat child labour in India, which you can be, of course, well aware is a major area of concern in respect of child labour. Some good news. Now, today we estimate there are 168 million children at work. 168 million. That sounds like a terribly big number. The good news is that figure is 1/3 lower than what it was in the year 2000. So here is the lesson. We know what works to reduce child labour. We know the policy instruments. It has to do with education, particularly access to education. It has to do with community mobilisation, making child labour unacceptable. It has to do with offering minimum social protection to families who might otherwise send their kids to work. We know what works. And for a decade, we made enormous progress in the elimination of child labour. My worry is that the momentum has stopped. The international community, for reasons I find difficult to explain, is no longer investing heavily, as it was, in helping countries to eliminate child labour. Now, we have a chance to put that right, because we're going to a World Congress against child labour in Argentina in November. And I hope this will give new dynamism to the global campaign to get rid of child labour. And the idea that child labour is an inevitable and inescapable side effect of poverty is wrong. It's a mistake. If we believe that, we inhibit ourselves from achieving something which is in the 2030 development agenda and which we can achieve. So there's good news, but there's also need for much better news. The question of precariousness at work, if I can paraphrase the second question, we are seeing a diversification of work forms. You know, in the ILO vocabulary, we still use the phrase standard employment form. And we understand by that full-time, permanent work contract, employer-employee. You go to work and you have basically a permanent relationship. That situation today corresponds to about 25% of the global workforce. Now, of course, a lot of other people are in informality. That's one thing. But in our societies, industrial societies, in fact, all types of societies, we're seeing a growing diversification of employment forms. Temporary work, part-time work. We're seeing the appearance of the platform or gig economy, which raises a whole series of other questions. But to give you one example, being again a Brit, 900,000 people in the UK are working on 0-hour contracts. And that means that you get a SMS, a text, on a Sunday night to tell you if you're wanted for work on Monday, for a day. And the next day it could be different, and the next day it could be different. So we have reached extremes of flexibility, extremes of precariousness, which I think have to be addressed. Now, I accept that diversification of work possibilities can be positive. If we're talking about allowing people to choose their options at work, to combine their professional responsibilities with family responsibilities, diversification is a good thing. It offers options. But it should not be an imposed option. It should be a choice. And there is a big difference between, for example, somebody who works part-time because they want to work part-time and somebody who works part-time because they have no alternative but to work part-time. So we can see in the same phenomenon very different experiences. I think the question is how we offer people opportunities to take the choice that they want. And we have a long way to go in that. And I'm not sure that the direction of change is very positive at the moment.
Two more questions. We have one in the back on this side.
I'm Ramesh. I'm associated with the UNUIAS. My question is also related to migrant workers. As you indicated that regular and orderly migration may help solve some problems, but what we can see now is much of labor migration now is regular. For instance, migrants working in Qatar, coming from Nepal or Bangladesh, Lao people working in Thailand, they are mostly regular migrant workers. But what we can see is the terms and conditions of work, as you said, precarity or precariousness of work, it's so adverse that they can't generate remittances and send that remittance back home to support their families. So what are the key initiatives taken by ILO to address these problems?
Okay, and one more. There's in the back there. In the back.
Hi there, my name's Darcy. I'm a master's student at ICU at a university here. And my question is, an obvious way to distribute more employment is to reduce the working week, hopefully through policy, but people have large mortgages and these sorts of things, so the lifestyle hasn't adjusted to a lower working week. Just wondering if there's any policies or ideas that are coming out around reducing the working week.
Sure. Firstly, on the question about migration, a very important question. We know that there are situations where legal migration, regular migration, is still associated with very abusive conditions. The example, if I got the question right, was given of Nepalese migration to, for example, Qatar. Now, this is a situation which is very particular. The destination countries, particularly in the Gulf region, are countries where, for example, there are no trade union rights. There are no basic protections for working people. So a Nepalese worker getting on the aeroplane to go to Qatar, for example, is subject to a high level of danger of abuse. Part of this abuse comes through abusive recruitment practices, charging workers very high fees, which leaves them indebted, and that can lead to situations of forced labor, and also simply ignorance about the conditions that they will face when they get to the destination country. I had the experience of being in Kathmandu at the end of last year, going to a center that was processing migrant workers going to the Gulf. And one young man said to me, well, I'm going to the Gulf. I said, what do you expect when you get there? He says, I don't really know. He says, but I have friends who are in Qatar already. And I said, well, what do they tell you? And he said, well, they tell me, and my colleague was with me, even if you're starving, don't come here. And he said, I'm going, but I'm still going. Why? Because he was a young man. He had nothing to do in Nepal. He wanted some adventure. He wanted to make some money. And so people in this terrible situation of vulnerability still go into these very abusive situations. Now, what are we doing? Well, in the ILO, we have a major process open in connection with Qatar. We are seeking to try to win from Qatar recognition that they have major problems. They recognize those problems. By the way, the spotlight's on them because it's the World Cup in Qatar, for those of you who watch football. And to try for them to agree to undertake some work programs with us. It's tough, but we have to get to these areas which for too long have been no-go countries for proper labour practices. And it's really very, very serious, and we are making our best efforts. I can't pretend it's easy to try to break into these no-go areas. The very good question about working time, which I put into the context of the discussions I've had here in Japan about reducing excessive overtime. It's been one of the subjects of conversation, excessive working hours in Japan. You know, the tendency for a long time, and it's sort of a barometer of social progress, is to bring down working time. The very first ILO Labour Convention from 1919 established the idea of a 40-hour working week in 1919. 40-hour working week, 8-hour working day, 5-day working week. Beautiful. That was a sort of the model that people established in 1919 as a model of social progress. The world of work has become much more complicated than that. But, as you're probably aware, there are countries which have established a 35-hour working week, France, some parts of Germany, as a social goal and a legally guaranteed maximum. Interestingly, the ceiling is going up. France seems to be on the point of abandoning the 35-hour working week. The newly elected president says, I want to get rid of it. Now, my view is the following. People will work the hours that they need to make a decent living. So everything depends upon wages, in my regard. People will make a rational economic choice between more or less working time and more or less income, depending on their choices and their needs. But the fact of the matter, in a global economy where wages for 30 years have grown more slowly than productivity, where the share of national income going to wages has been declining for 30 years, people are not in a position to choose to work less if their income from working less will not support the standard of living that they want. So these are very complex questions, but I think they're very relevant questions, because if we are entering an era of work scarcity, the notion of sharing work is going to become very relevant. But that takes us back to the notions of universal income guarantees and supplementing work income with other areas of socially guaranteed income. So it's a very difficult complex of questions involved.
Thank you so much. We're going to wrap up, but I'm going to use my prerogative as moderator to ask one final question. You started our conversation by telling us the history of the ILO. So maybe you can end by telling us what you see as the future of the ILO. How does the ILO need to adapt itself and its work to the future of work?
Yep. Well, you're asking the question which I hope will appear as if by magic from our Future of Work initiative, because that initiative is very consciously designed to produce the answer to that question. How do we need to change? I really understand, and I think any organization should not fall victim to inertia. It is very improbable, isn't it, that a 100-year-old organization like the ILO can stand still and the world of work can transform around it, and it can then still hope to be relevant. So we have to learn the lessons of change. We have to adapt, I think, some of our basic conceptions about labour market regulation. But we should never lose from sight that the objective of our organisation is the promotion of social justice. I think there is, with all of the political fluctuations that we see around the world, I think there is a universal and unchanging appetite among citizens for fairness. As human beings, we have a basic reflex for fairness. We want to be treated decently, and by and large, we want to treat other people decently. Now, the mechanisms, the methods to ensure fairness at work are changing. They have to change. But we have to make sure that we understand the direction of travel. Our direction of travel is towards more fairness at work as an ambition, as an objective. I worry that some of the dynamics which are operating in the world of work today are taking us in the opposite direction. I say that with regret, but I think it is true. But I believe, and we see it in some of the political turbulence of our time, that the appetite now is for greater social justice. I haven't answered your question, but I'm giving you the rationale for the process of reflection in which we are engaged. And I hope that with the participation of all of our member states, by the way, Japan is playing a very active role in this process, we'll find some answers.
Thank you so much, Director General. You've given us a lot to think about. And I know that there were many questions that we didn't get to, but the Director General has kindly agreed to stick around for about 15 minutes after the event. So please do feel free to come up and chat informally with him if we didn't get to your question. And I just want to remind the audience that there is a drinks and a reception outside, and we're going to be showing a video about the ILO's relationship with Japan during the reception. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you.